Hello and welcome to the Property Roundup here on iPropertyRadio with myself, Carol Tallon, the show where we chat to industry experts to get a view and activity on the ground and to learn about new trends emerging. This show is sponsored by daft.ie, Ireland's most visited property website. Today, I'm delighted to be joined by Diarmuid McMahon, Managing Director of Sherry Fitzgerald McMahon in Ennis, County Clare. You're very welcome, Diarmuid. Thank you for joining me.
Good morning, Carol.
Um, Diarmuid, before we started recording, I was just sharing my really genuinely happy memories of Ennis from my time living in North Kerry, and Ennis would have been such such an important link for us. But the road infrastructure and everything has improved so much over the past 2 decades that it has really transformed Ennis and the accessibility of Ennis to the rest of the country. So you might just give us a bit of an overview as to what way the property market is faring at the moment.
Yeah, so our business is focused in around Ennis town and in West Clare. So we do out in West Clare, we do a lot of kind of holiday home type properties and principal private residence as well, from from Loophead right up to Ballyvaughan in the Burn and whatnot. So it's quite a large area, and into East Clare as well. So as you've said, I suppose Ennis is has been blessed with motorway infrastructure, certainly. So if you're going from Ennis to Dublin, you've actually got two motorway options. It's kind of equidistant depending on where you're going in Dublin, but you can go up the Galway motorway or you can go the Limerick motorway. It's about the same. So really, really good road interconnectivity and train service as well. And then Shannon Airport is 15, 20 minutes down the road from. I could actually probably get into the centre of London from Ennis quicker than a lot of people could do from the centre of Dublin into the centre of London. Just it's so easy to get in and out of Shannon Airport. So, and that's been reflected in terms of what we've seen, particularly since COVID, is a transition of the type of purchaser that we've had. So we've seen a lot of 30, 40s who would have been from Clare originally, who might have moved abroad, might be in Dublin, and are now settling down to have families. And I suppose that transition through to remote working has given them an awful lot more flexibility. And we're seeing those incomes come into the property market here in Clare as well, which particularly in what would have been the higher end of the market has really kind of nearly put it on steroids, I would say a small bit, in terms of the purchase power that those buyers have. Because just wage levels and income levels that would not be atypical of what you might have in the region. So that coupled with no different, I suppose, to a lot of parts of the country, is very restricted supply. Definitely, I'm 20 years in the business. I can't recall ever. I mean, even I went through the Celtic Tiger and times where there was, but we never had a little supply. And I suppose at that stage, we would have had a lot of new homes construction in, say, 2004, 5, 6, 7. At the moment, it's new homes construction to date has been very restricted to really the local authority, and social housing in particular have been the main players in the market. Market viability, I think previously may have been an issue. I think that's becoming less of an issue. We had I don't know if you're familiar, Carol, with the first home scheme. So that's probably a really important scheme in addition to the Help to Buy scheme. So that's the shared equity scheme effectively from the government. The Clare ceiling was at about, I think last year was at 325. It got increased to 350. So the first home scheme, the way that works is if you're a penny over the threshold, you don't qualify for it at all. If you're a penny below, you qualify up to 20% if you're getting the first home scheme or the Help to Buy scheme also. So even at 350, our neighbouring counties are up over 400,000. So we're at a little bit of a disadvantage because it doesn't cost that much less to build a house in Clare than it does in Limerick or Galway. So our road infrastructure is really good, really good place to live, very, very popular as a place to live. And one of our, I suppose, of our advantages is historically, if you go back 100 years, has been one of our disadvantages is from a town centre and retail perspective is trying to compete then, particularly with Limerick, I suppose, which is our closest neighbour, and somewhat to Galway as well. I'd say more to Limerick. I think people just they lose the will to live trying to deal with Galway traffic. Sorry now for anybody who's in Galway, but Limerick is just that from Ennis is that bit more accessible. So, and I suppose we're very blessed with a very special town centre, very attractive town centre. I mentioned to you before we came on there, just it's actually going through a transformation internally in the town at the moment, which means it's quite busy with construction works going on, but it's all for the better in the future. It's a medieval town, small streets, very attractive kind of niche shops, a lot of very popular with women's boutiques. So it's very specialized. And that's where its future is. It's finding its own niche as to attract people in. And I think when these works are done, it'll really be to its benefit.
Yeah, there's a lot going on there. There's a lot of almost competing dynamics at play. So let's strip it back maybe to who's buying at the moment. I was reflecting on the changes in infrastructure over the last 20 years, but of course, since COVID, so much has changed. And a big part of that is around people choosing to return west of the Shannon if they don't have to be within a certain commute or regular commute. But as you rightly identified, that's bringing a different income level in. So what's that doing for the home buyers who've been saving and trying to get their mortgage there, who are maybe one or two parties of a couple are trying to buy a house, not necessarily in Ennis, but even in the environs? Like, what's that doing in terms of affordability?
Well, I suppose just going back to that kind of post-COVID period, I mean, I think really prior to COVID, parts of West Clare hadn't really had the benefit of returning to, some kind of normal economic level in terms of property. I mean, it was still in some areas reasonably sluggish. And if you look then at hotspots where, the holiday home hotspots of, say, Lahinch, Liscannor in particular, and also in Kilkee, which was really people buying second homes and some very wealthy people buying second homes. But when you moved out of those areas, you had really attractive towns like Ennistimon, Miltown-Malbay, Kilrush, that really hadn't benefited from an economy that was on the up. And really since COVID then, as stock became tighter in the more urban areas, it pushed things west and that dynamic of people coming from different parts of the country. But even at that, if you were to look at current construction levels, there's still an awful lot of value to be had, I would say, in County Clare relative to its neighbouring counties on a price per square foot, price per square metre. So, that has really taken legs, I suppose, since COVID. And I suppose that it is not easy for a first-time buyer out there at the moment to compete. It really is quite difficult. I think last year we would have had, and the last few years, and I mean, I know the Sherry Fitzgerald figures show it, that for every 3 landlords leaving the market, you only had 1 entering. And we've seen that to a lesser extent now, just in terms of, I suppose, the periods of notice that landlords have to give in order to get access to a property. Ennis was made a rent pressure zone before Christmas. Shannon is made a rent pressure zone just before Christmas as well. I can see that a number of landlords, because of that, are deciding to get out of the market. But as I say, for every 3 leaving the market, you've only 1 entering, which is reducing that rental stock. So yeah, it's probably the biggest issue in terms of what I'm most concerned about is getting new homes into the area. And as I mentioned there, I mean, an awful lot of the new homes that have been built to date, which are badly needed, and it's no criticism of social housing. If anything, my criticism would be that the whole way through the recession, the state should have been building social housing. It should have been keeping a pulse in our construction industry. It should have been investing in infrastructure to keep a pulse in our construction industry. But because by failing to do that, not only did we have to rebuild a housing market, we had to rebuild a construction industry at the same time. So please let that never happen again. But like last year, the figures show it was about 450 new homes built in the entire county of Clare. And only 50 of those were for the private market. And a lot of those houses would be one-off builds. Do you know what I mean? So the number of private homes available in the new market is really quite limited. There are some larger planning permissions, unfortunately, have gotten stuck. Glenveigh have quite a large planning permission in Ennis with about 280 units in it. Planning was granted in that through in Bourg-Penol about a year and a half ago, and now that's been pulled to judicial review. So that's tied up in knots. And I think there's a number of instances of that where we urgently need that product, where pricing, in my opinion, is viable. We've raised first homes scheme ceiling. There are buyers that there. And I think, you know, the dynamic of who's buying has changed. We see from those that I'm speaking to who where there are new home schemes available, like in Shannon, there are some new home schemes available, very little available in Ennis at the moment. You know, you see a lot of new Irish, you know, not from Ireland originally, but have become very important Irish citizens contributing to our economy. And they are, what we find is they probably are more open to where they're going to live if a new home scheme is available. So Irish people tend to be quite conservative in terms of where they want to live, while new Irish are much more open to what we might think is a secondary location. And they say, well, I'm getting a new home. I'm getting the government who are giving me help to buy in a first home scheme. Why wouldn't I do it? And they're absolutely right. And they're getting their foot on the ladder, and they're saving hard, and they're working hard. And they seem to be a very important part of the market, of the new homes market that does exist.
Yeah, that's really interesting about Shannon, because that's an area that, you know, you touched on it there, but in the early days of the recovery from the crash, and even a few years into the recovery, when we started to identify places not just stabilizing but actually start to pick up again. I at the time was working all over Ireland, so I was traveling a lot, and I would have spent time in West Clare, and it was very clear to me that the recovery didn't happen. Not just it didn't happen all at once. There were areas that I feel like the recovery didn't happen at all. And in fact, up and down the West Coast, I think we've talked about COVID and the recession, but in between those two events, there was a very big event for the West Coast, which was the introduction of the Wild Atlantic Way and the introduction of not just the route and then the associated businesses and coffee shops and tourism springing up, but it also really opened people's eyes as to the accessibility of the area, but also the number of derelict and vacant homes. Correct. So when you were talking about the number of new homes delivered in County Clare last year, and you referred to a number of them being one-off homes, and we might just come back and touch on the planning in a short while as well. But in terms of vacant and derelict homes, are you seeing an increased demand for those since the scheme has been tweaked and improved?
Absolutely. There's no question about it. It's injected life into some of those properties. And it's not perfect, but it is definitely helped inject some life into those properties. So you're seeing, you know, cottages and things like that are in the countryside, where now the only thing I would caution that with is we do find that properties that, you know, where people are selling, that people are much more likely to buy something that's turnkey, really because of that anxiety about, well, how much is it actually going to cost me to do the work, and and then B, can I actually get somebody to do it?
Yeah.
And then C, how long is it going to take? You know what I mean? So taking on projects at the moment, people are very careful in terms of taking on projects in construction. Now, as you know, construction price inflation seems to, along with all inflation, has moderated and is becoming like it was 12 months ago. It was a circus. I mean, people couldn't plan at all. I mean, so you're trying to plan a project. Well, is it going to be 200,000 or is it going to be 250 or is it going to be three? So at least now you're getting to a point where, look, the signs are that if anything, interest rates are probably going to come down. So that gives, cost of finance stability. While last year, right up until September, you had these spiraling interest rate increases, which in my opinion are biting in terms of people's disposable income now. It actually takes that amount of time for it to chew into people's disposable income. But construction price inflation seems to have moderated, so it gives people that bit more certainty in terms of taking on a derelict house or a cottage or something like that. Probably more the vacant one, to be honest, than the derelict one. The derelict one, like if something is derelict, I don't know if an extra 20 grand is going to take it out of dereliction. Because you're 50,000 at the vacant and 70,000 at the derelict. It seems to be more around the vacant house grant, but it's definitely a help. Definitely a help.
I think you're much more generous or maybe more compassionate in how you're interpreting people wanting turnkey, maybe that uncertainty around price. And as somebody who was embarking on a build, I know that the construction material costs and that volatility over the past 2 years has been absolutely shocking, much more so than I've ever experienced in the last 22 years in the marketplace. But is a part of this generational, as in people wanting not necessarily an easy solution, but are we looking at a generation of maybe instant gratification or this Instagramification of homes where they actually want something that is Instagram ready when they walk into it? Because I don't know what it was like when you bought your first home, but I definitely had no furniture for the first 6 months in my first home.
Yeah. So I think Diarmuid McMahon has a lot to answer for, I think is what you're saying, Carol. Yeah.
He does.
Yeah, there definitely is. There definitely is an element to that. And look, it's like anything. And I suppose probably a generation of people who, very good professionals, good incomes, they don't have the time either to be taking on those kind of projects, But we again, going back to that point I was making about the new Irish, they just seem to be more prepared to roll up their sleeves and get stuck in.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? And build their way up.
Because they can see the opportunity to add value. And I think there's an amazing opportunity to add value. So I know the schemes that are available for new homes, and they're very important, but I would love to see a greater emphasis on like you rightly identified, there's a very big difference between a derelict home and a home that's been vacant for 2 years. And usually you're looking at redoing or a whole new septic tank system. You're looking at some big outlay that you don't necessarily see. And that's definitely making it cost prohibitive. Now, there have been some changes in terms of the grants, how it can be drawn down, but also actually local authority home loans now are actually covering the cost of doing the work that can then be recouped on the grant, which is a huge change, because in fact we'd love if other lenders, not just home loan, not just the local authority home loans, were doing that, but actually so there have been some real logistical challenges to drawing down those grants, which I think the department has looked at and is learning from and is tweaking as they go. But to my mind, they're just so important, not just to eliminate waste and to embrace sustainability, but actually I think they're a real route to sustainable living in the rural. And we know the policy for the current government is veering absolutely away from one-off rural housing, which is problematic in its own way anyway. But if we could use what is existing in the landscape in a better, more efficient way and make that more accessible to everybody, I think we'd be meeting some of our sustainability goals. In terms of one-off homes in County Clare, how difficult is it to get planning now?
Not easy. Not easy. I mean, it's the same kind of restrictions that you have elsewhere. So there are nuggets of like cluster zonings where there might be a zoning in a little hamlet or something like that, where the planning permission application would be open to all applicants. But typically in the countryside, when you moved out of zoned areas, you're really looking at having to have come from that specific area and having a housing need, which is one that people seem to forget quite a bit. And I would say my experience of a lot of we would regularly get a telephone call from a landlord saying, I have a site. And we would say, well, do you have planning permission? No. Is it zoned? No. Well, you have a field. It may
Yeah,
become a site, but at the moment it's a field because
yeah,
without planning permission, it is a field. And I suppose maybe not appreciating that the purchaser of that site is taking an awful lot of the risk, in fact, to add value to your property because
mm,
they're paying for the planning application, they're paying for the percolation test, so there's an awful lot of risk actually been placed back on the potential purchaser. And I would encourage anybody who potentially is thinking about they've some road frontage or whatnot, is to put that investment into at least having the percolation test done, which makes it more
yeah,
marketable, or potentially ensuring that, look, if there isn't a mains water there, that there's a well. But I suppose that where you're seeing that is people who need to trade up. Their families have gotten bigger, they're looking for more space, and I suppose we're where we're having when your stock gets very low, like you have in the market at the moment, the side effect of that is that other people who want to move, stop making decisions to move because psychologically it's, well, there's nothing available, there's no point trying, or it's just too hard. And in actual fact, those that attempt it generally succeed. But as people become more mature and as they get older, that it's not easy process to go through. And every week we have telephone calls from more mature people who wish to downsize and maybe free up their stock for the family who wants to trade up into it, but
yeah.
they're caught in the loop of they need to sell the property in order to buy, and they won't do that unless they know where they're going to go. And in terms of unlocking square footage in this country, it, in my mind, is probably one of the most important things that needs to be addressed. So
Yeah.
rather than somebody going out to a greenfield site, is, well, will they take on an existing property and renovate that and modernize it? But how do we help that elderly person transition to a downsized property, and financially support them to get from one end of that step to the other end of that step and transition the cash flow, that they don't have to move out of their house first, or that there's some way of helping them do that, because there is an enormous amount of housing stock in Ireland tied up with people who don't want to live in those houses anymore but are caught and they can't move.
Diarmuid, I'm really glad you brought this up because this is something we've touched on a couple of times over the past year and really looking at housing options for our aging population, but in the private sector, for those that won't be catered for in through existing social housing and other sheltered housing schemes. And you touched on the solution there, which feels like infinitely solvable. We just need to bridge the cash flow, because actually I think the latest stats tell us that it's over 250,000 homes in Ireland have 2 or more bedrooms that are not regularly in use. So that's
Yes.
huge waste when we know that there's people who want to move into those areas. But so the cash flow was one thing, but putting pressure on that is the lack of availability. So for the people you're talking to who are in that position, because you're dealing with some large market towns, but also some rural areas, they would be sellers that you're meeting who are in that position. How close to home do they want to stay, or what's their priority for the move? What are they trying to achieve with the move?
Yeah, it's funny. Like in some of the private new home schemes that were available in the last few years around the town, the limited number that were there, there was quite a number of people from more rural areas in West Clare and whatnot, where maybe they had kids who've, they educated too well and moved on and moved abroad and did whatever they did. And now you could have an elderly individual or an elderly couple, and they could be in a remote enough location and want to get closer to social services and social infrastructure. And we're buying those new properties that were available. So there's definitely, so it's not just people within the town, which would absolutely be important, but more rural areas moving in because they're conscious that they need to be closer to social services that are available. And I just can't overemphasize how important it is to solve this problem, because it would free up so much housing stock for families. And the thing is, when you look at new housing stock, and this is, I suppose, the last piece in the puzzle in terms of new housing when it does come, we really have to temper. Well, it's easy for me to say I'm not a first-time buyer anymore, but that expectation of square footage. The cost of building energy rated houses is extremely high per square foot. If you look at the densities that on Board Penala will insist on, which is another thing I can't get my head on, as to how local authorities are prepared to grant planning permission on lower densities, but then if the scheme gets appealed to on Board Penala, they'll unwrap all of that planning permission and say that doesn't fit in. And I know they're trying to work on that now to try and improve that connection so that at least everybody's following the same hymn sheet, which they haven't been to date. But my point is that units are getting smaller. The family unit is getting smaller. The number of people per unit is getting smaller. And if all that happened was our population stayed the same, we need more units. And that, I suppose, kind of neatly comes around to our urban areas and our towns, where people live and how far away from services they live. And environmentally, our houses and our units are going to be smaller in the new builds, and they will be less remote and higher density and closer to those services, so that as people age, they're less dependent on the car and everything else. And that is going to happen. And I think that has nothing to do with anything other than Irish people get their heads around that. And we haven't, because we still want the house in the half acre.
Well, yeah, I'm guilty of that myself. I live in a field and wouldn't have it any other way. However, in terms of, I do take the view that actually, I think that we have essentially rushed a generation that wasn't quite ready, and it's our own fault within the industry that they don't like what they're being offered, because the reality is, when Ireland started to deliver apartments, we deliver them really badly. We deliver them badly built in a lot of cases, but in almost every case, we deliver them badly designed. So they were never designed for whole of life living. They were never designed to be able to accommodate anything other than professionals, young professionals sharing. And depending on where you were on the income spectrum was the quality of offering. But actually, it never provided for families or pushchairs, or in a lot of cases for people with disability or mobility challenges. We built badly. And I think most Irish people who have travelled will have lived in cities. It would have lived in city apartments in other countries and not had a problem with it, because they were designed for whole of life living, for storage. And so I think in Ireland we delivered badly for decades, and then we were surprised that people didn't like what we delivered. And on the other side of it, from one semi-rural to another, the reality is that for a lot of Irish people, we are just within 1 to 2 generations off the land. So we have been asked to change a lot in a short amount of time, and not everybody's ready for it. And I think what's really interesting is that we've never really had the data to support what people choose. But since COVID, we saw people choose when they weren't tied to their commute, their daily commute. We saw people choose. And in a lot of cases, they chose rural Ireland. And I think it is easy to say that that's for cheaper prices or for more space, but I just don't believe that's the full conversation. I think they choose it for quality of life as well. the danger with something as successful as the Wild Atlantic Way, which I think has been phenomenal for the west coast of Ireland, but the danger of something like that is that we allow this misconception that rural Ireland is somehow this museum to be visited at weekends, and it's not. We need to understand that actually living in the landscape is normal, that we need for the landscapes to be preserved as living landscapes, but we need to do it in a sustainable way that we've never done it before. So actually there's a reimagining of how we live in rural Ireland. There's a reimagining of what our villages are to be, because I think we can look across
very
Europe
much so.
and see examples of this being done badly. You know, I remember walking across northern Spain and seeing farmers cycle out to their land with a spade or a shovel or whatever it is on the side of the bicycle, you know, cycling the 1 or 2 kilometers out to the farm because they live in the centre, because they weren't allowed to live on the farm. And there's no next generation coming up to take care of that. So we do need living landscapes. The land needs custodians, but we need to be doing it in a way that is sustainable and viable. And I think when you're looking at, I think Clare is a really interesting example, because you have people who can afford to position themselves there and take advantage of the beauty. And then you've got people who are working every day on the land to make that beautiful who can't get planning. That feels wrong.
Well, I mean, yeah, typically, where, you know, they should qualify. You know what I mean? They should qualify for planning, and quite rightly, I agree with you. They should qualify for planning, and I agree with everything you said there. But for the vast majority of people, the more than average, the way new housing is going to be provided is going to be dictated to a large extent by the environmental agenda, whether we like it or not. And I'm not criticizing people for how they perceive that, because I think you've hit the nail on the head. The product that they've been faced with has been very poor. I mean, even in the town here, you know, we're looking back at a lot of our apartment stock is old Section 23 tax investment stuff.
They were the scourge of every student town and market town in Ireland. Yeah,
dreadful. Well, sorry now, but it's an important for points in people's lives. It's important, but not somewhere I think anybody would like to live indefinitely. You know, a stepping stone, but and then that ties in with those downsizers. So I suppose, fortunately, I suppose in Ennis, you know, there's ambitions about the future in terms of maximizing growth and opportunity for the town. So I was involved back in 2018. I was president of Ennis Chamber of Commerce at the time. We were involved in a project and contributing to a project about creating that vision up to 2040. So similar to the 2030 DAC that was created for Limerick, an investment vehicle for the local authority, they created one for Ennis up until 2040 with a vision to try and identify sites within the town that could be developed and you know, really position the town and give it a future. And I think importantly within that, for me, with any urban area, the villages you spoke about, anywhere, I mean, there are a few key things boxes that must be ticked. So I think the first one is that it's accessible, that you can get in and you can get out easily, and that you have confidence about where you get in and get out. That's a challenge for Ennis at the moment when you're an old medieval town. Just the layout and the one-way system, as attractive as it is, it is a challenge. Very car dependent. We don't, as of yet, have a public transport system. Part of the 2040 plan is next year that there will be a public transport bus system, which for one of the biggest towns in the country, it's incredible to think that there hasn't been a public transport system available. So that is coming into place next year.
Especially when you have the proximity to Galway and Limerick. So
but I'm just talking. No, there is bus services intercity, but not within the town itself. So not you know, getting from one side of the town to the other. We haven't had a public transport system. Like, it's just shocking. So that is coming next year. So that accessibility place in terms of how then people who are driving, how they get in and how they park and how they get access to the services in the town. So that accessibility is number one for me. Number two then is that the public realm and the spaces that people have within that town then are they're places that they want to be, that they enjoy, and that to get people back living in town centres as well, and to enjoy those town centres and bring life to them and bring life to the nighttime economy, rather than somewhere that just, shuts down after 6 o'clock in the evening, which isn't the case in Ennis, but in a lot of towns and villages that is the case. But we'd like to get more people living in the town. And then the third one is that it's safe. That you've got somewhere where people feel safe to go to at night, and that it's an environment where they can comfortably bring their family for whatever event. And that's the ambition, I suppose. The process, there's a lot of different opinions as to how those goals should be achieved within the town. There's some controversy, and it has stimulated a lot of debate, particularly on some of our car park sites in the town centre, different views in terms of how those car parking sites should be used. And it's a very spirited conversation, particularly coming up to our local elections in the next couple of days, and has really probably grabbed the headlines in terms of the local elections. But in my view, as long as that discourse is respectful, we're having that conversation. So that's democracy working. That's a good thing. We're actually talking about it. Because if we weren't talking about it, and if there wasn't differences of opinion, we'd be in a very bad place, because nothing would be happening. So I think we're very fortunate as a town that we're having those conversations.
Look, you're absolutely right. And these conversations, like, we're involved in placemaking initiatives up and down the country, and I could say that these kind of conversations are happening everywhere. All of our towns and villages and cities are two-car dependent. And the reality is, we know that that's a problem in terms of in terms of the livability, walkability, the attractiveness of spending time in a location. But I also understand the business owners, their concerns, not just in terms of deliveries and services, but also people accessing what they're doing. So
Absolutely.
To my mind, there needs to be a cultural shift. I think in Ireland, and I would be guilty of it myself, we tend to go where you can pull the car up outside. And I think that needs to change. I just don't think we live in a country where we necessarily want that. And you look at towns like certainly in Ennis, and I know there's been a town centre first policy kind of rolled out for Kilrush, and there's been work, interesting placemaking initiatives in Ennistimon and Lahinch. And every village and every town has its unique features. And when I think of Ennis as an outsider, somebody who has never lived in the area but has spent time, I always think of the really rich culture. So there's always a sense of it's always had that boutique quality, that boutique value. Traditional musicians, the music spilling out onto the street in the summertime. So it's definitely had it has always had that rich culture side. And if you can bring that into the public realm, but it's very difficult to do that if you've got traffic jams or people parking. So in terms of the medieval centre core, is it planned to take away some of the car parking from just your actual the village, or sorry, the town centre, that core where you have the beautiful boulangerie and you have some really nice spaces, not just around the corner from the hotel. You've got some beautiful areas, but car parking has always been allowed there. Is it the plan to remove car parking from those areas?
Yes, there would be plans to remove some of the car parking and develop on those sites as well. And I suppose that's where I suppose a lot of the controversy stems from. I think the ambition in some of those developments is to try and centre a additional retail offering that we don't have in the town. We're quite restricted in terms of, with older buildings, in terms of the square footage that's available from a retail perspective. So, as I said earlier on, we're very much competing with the Crescent Shopping Centre in Limerick, if the truth be told. So it's trying to provide a broader retail offering to the town centre, to really try and anchor it to the benefit of all retailers. But that is very difficult for current retailers when they're fearful of a lot of their customers not being able to physically get into the town. So, and I completely understand that. I mean, that's very, very worrying for them. I'm not in the retail business. I don't depend on footfall that goes past my door. I'm in a very different type of business. So for them, that's a real challenge and very worrying. And I suppose the onus is on it's on the local authority, it's on all of us, it's on the Ennis 2040 DAC, is to ensure that there is accessibility for people to get into the town centre, the public transport, which thankfully we're getting next year, we're promised, will be a part of that, and then providing proper traffic management, parking management, and accessibility, and additional parking to ensure that anything is lost is replaced, and using the parking asset that we have in the town a lot better than we're probably currently using it. That the right people who are there all day are not parking in the places that are close by, that can be used by people who need to, the customers who are actually paying all our wages, that they can get in and get out that more easily. So there's a lot going on there, but again, I think the important point is we have something very special, something very unique, and I'm confident that the right road will be traveled eventually, and because it's when you have something special and unique like we have in our town centre, we're so fortunate to have. I mean, if you were Walt Disney, you'd be trying to create it. You know what I mean? So, that if that is protected and looked after well, and is made available to people rather than cars only, that becomes something very, very special that people will want to visit on a Saturday and Sunday and Monday to Friday. So to the benefit of all people in business within the town.
Look, I think Ennis has always had that something special, and I'm conscious of time, and I know we have to finish up, but just because Ennis 2040 is such an important initiative, just before we finish up today, you might just unlock, are there many derelict or vacant or underused spaces or buildings within the town centre core that actually can be unlocked, and is enough being done to entice private sector in, not just public sector?
I think there has, to be fair, there are quite, and there are certain parts of the town where, and I'm not going to name names, but there are certain parts of the town where, and I suppose, look, at a certain point with some buildings, I think really consideration is to what's their economic viability going forward, and it may be that it's residential rather than commercial. Do you know what I mean? And again, that trying to get people back living in the town centre. But if the space outside their door is somewhere where they want to live, then they will do that. If it's a pleasant place to be, which it is, but it can be an awful lot better. So it's trying to make, the economic viability of some of those buildings, unfortunately, for all of them, it won't always be commercial. So I think that transition and that thinking has to evolve.
When I suppose finally, when we've touched on housing options for our aging population that could be delivered through the private sector, I wonder, would infill sites in towns and village centres be attractive for people? Because I suspect they would, and in some cases they would have a large enough site to have a garden. But if we were looking at residential use, maybe it's not the highest density that we might require, but it feels that infill sites could be redesigned, reimagined to make for really good town centre and village centre living for people who are looking to make that transition now. So I think all of the ingredients are there, and it feels that maybe policy isn't as well joined up as we'd like to see, and there has definitely been, you've touched on an important development there for, was it 280 homes that's caught in judicial review at the moment. So we know that the lack of decision-making power within the local authorities over the past kind of decade and a half has certainly been a challenge, and hopefully the new planning and development bill will go some way towards rectifying that and actually delivering the development that communities want, that they want and will use.
it's incredibly frustrating, the planning process. I mean, we're looking at sites that it's years and years and years and years trying to get through various, from my perspective, let the local authority do their job. Do you know what I mean? I can't understand why if they grant a planning permission on something and somebody doesn't like one part of that development, that the entire development in its entirety has to be opened up again by Bord Pleanála. Surely they can look at the item on which it's been objected on rather than everything about it. Can they please trust the local authority to do their job? If that objection hadn't gone in, it would have been built. You know, if somebody didn't like a manhole in one corner of the development because it's over their back wall, that development would have been built. So why not deal with the manhole? Why is the entire development stripped back, and on Bord Pleanála are just so far behind? Look, we could talk about.
I know, and you know that's definitely kind of part of a larger conversation for another day. But I suppose the only bit of solace we know is that a lot of these challenges, difficulties, flaws in the planning system have been identified. Now, whether they've been properly addressed in the new planning and development bill is a different question. But we know that there's agreement on the problem, which has to be a good starting point.
It is. Unfortunately, a lot of the professionals that I speak to would say that probably in the short run, if anything, it might get a little worse because just when you change any system, it takes time for it to bed down and people to get their head around it, and just so that's going to take a little bit of time. And look, you need democratic process. People need that opportunity. I'm not talking about railroading things, but like it's that balance between the rights of the individual and then the rights of the community as a whole, and we've lost that balance.
But do you know, but the interesting thing, and I know we all frame the conversation like that, but the reality is, if you look at the projects that do go to judicial review, they're not being brought by members of the local community. They're being brought by environmental groups that don't live within the vicinity of the development. So I think, again, we're maybe being overly generous with how we're interpreting that. So, and you're right, the new planning and development bill doesn't stop that the way it should. But again, part of a larger conversation of the world in one session, Diarmuid. We might just have to try again in a few months' time. But thank you so much. Before we finish up, final call out for people who are house hunting kind of west of the Shannon. Maybe they're based or working in the wider Limerick region. You know, what would you say to attract them into Ennis, into looking at kind of not just Ennis, but kind of the wider West Clare market?
I think accessibility is really important. A and B, it's quality of life, quality of services, quality of community. That accessibility to the coast, accessibility to a beautiful town, with a fantastic community and really good facilities and schools. You know what I mean? What's not to like, Karen? You know, there's just there really is, for anybody who's in that Midwest area. It's a fantastic place to live, and so many people have made that choice. So and I suppose all we want to do is ensure that going forward, we have the product for them, and that is a challenge at the moment. But please, to anybody who does watch this, when people say, "Well, there's nothing available," there is always something, and those who want to go after it will, they'll find the right thing for themselves. It might take a little bit of time, but we'll get there.
You know, Diarmuid, I love that you were able to articulate all of these great things, leading with quality of life, and cheap houses didn't figure anywhere on the list. So again, I think rural Ireland needs a new brand manager.
We don't have cheap, we have good value.
No, but to be honest, that's not the draw. And like I said, rural Ireland needs a new brand manager. It needs a brand overhaul. It needs a retelling of its story, because there is magic to be rediscovered there, and it's just not reflected in policy, and that's something that we absolutely need to see changed. Thank you so much for taking us through and actually getting us excited about Ennis, and best of luck to the Ennis 2040 team as well. I think it's a really important initiative that they're embarking on. And so actually, I think your call to action there is for people maybe to expect to put a bit of work in, hunt out the opportunities, but there certainly are opportunities there. So thank you so much for taking us through them. That was Diarmuid McMahon, Managing Director of Sherry Fitzgerald McMahon in Ennis, County Clare. My thanks as always to producer Katie Tallon and the production team at Hear Me Roar Media. Also thanks to our show sponsor daft.ie, Ireland's most visited property website. And thank you indeed for tuning in. We'll catch you on the next episode of Property Roundup. In the meantime, please be sure to check out all of our other Irish and international real estate and construction shows here on iPropertyRadio.com.